Today's reading is in Exodus 3:16 through 20. Go assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Jason Green was the senior editor of Pitchfork, a popular online publication covering indie rock bands, reviewing different albums. And he had turned that hobby into a career, gotten married, carved out a life for himself in New York City, and he and his wife, Stacy, were in those first tumultuous years of parenting when your life is turned upside down by the sudden intrusion of a baby, turned upside down in ways you honestly can't really accurately explain, only profoundly experienced, turned upside down in ways that interrupt and affect everything, and turned upside down in ways that you would never ever trade back if you could. Their 2-year-old daughter, Greta, was absolutely everything to them. And one weekend, Greta was having a sleepover with her grandma on the Upper West Side, a little respite for the weary parents. And Greta and Grandma were sitting on a bench right near Central Park when a brick crumbled from a windowsill above, striking Greta in the head, killing her instantly. It was a freak accident. And in the years that followed, Jason, the writer of indie album reviews, became the author of a memoir about the maze of grief that he was never really able to find a way out of. And when my youngest child, Amos, was in the hospital living his first 30 days off machines, his chest cut open to repair a heart that was not assembled correctly in the womb. When I was living in the limbo of those days, I was dozing off at night reading Jason's memoir, a potentially ill-advised decision. And what struck me about it was how he talked about God. For Jason, if there was a God, he's a monster. He is the cruel taker of life and the permitter of evil. If there is a God, then he is to blame for Greta's tragic story and every other one like it. And for me, God was my lifeline. He was the only one who could possibly carry me through those 30 days. He was the creator of everything good, the sustainer of life, the one fighting a cosmic battle against evil and the tragedy of death. Now, my story turned out quite different from Jason's, and gratitude is far too small a word for that. But what I still think about is all that we have in common, and yet how God was such a different character in our imaginations as we have lived our respective stories. Stephen Fry, a comedian and outspoken atheist, was once interviewed and asked what he might say if upon dying he was confronted by a God who did turn out to be real after all. And he responded instinctively, I'd say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? A couple of years ago, I got to spend a week in a home with Jerry Sitzer and just a few others. He's a lifelong Jesus follower, and he's the author of A Grace Disguised, which is a book about the loss of his wife and 2 of his 4 children, and one accident from a drunk driver, and the God who buoyed their broken family through all of that loss toward redemption. Same God, very different perspectives on who he is and the role he plays in the world. Some in the 17th century American church used the Bible as a defense of the transatlantic slave trade. Some slave masters sat in pews on Sundays singing hymns, and they read their Bibles and prayed each morning while owning and abusing other people. Howard Thurman authored the brilliant book Jesus and the Disinherited, which Dr. King credits as his primary inspiration. Thurman's book shows us Jesus through the eyes of the American slave, a God who walks beside the oppressed, speaks for the voiceless, and fights for the powerless. Same God, very different perspectives on who that God is and the role he plays in the world. Exodus is the most referenced event in the Torah by the rest of the Bible. It is the defining event by which God told us his name, told us what he's like, told us about his person, his character. And when we look at Exodus, we are letting God introduce himself to us. And sometimes that will be a comforting affirmation of who we've always imagined God to be. And other times it'll be an important but potentially discomforting confrontation with who God really is and how he's different than we had imagined him to be. So we've been journeying through the Exodus story together as a church family. Week 1 is an introduction to the broad strokes and larger themes. Week 2, we slowed down and developed the characters. Last week, the plot thickened with a little bit of drama, and today, that drama reaches an absolute fever pitch. And for some, the God that you see in Exodus today will be a comforting affirmation of the God in your imagination. And for others, the same God will be more like a confrontation, more disorienting than comforting at first. And either way, it's important. It is important that we let God introduce himself to us rather than just create and imagine God in our own image. Because the way you interact with the world, how you interpret the events of your life, how you deal with life's blessings and tragedies, all of it is defined by who you believe God is. And Exodus is the definitive biblical event by which God introduced himself to his people. So today's teaching is rooted in Exodus 3, verses 16 through 20, which we read just a minute ago. But we're actually going to cover chapter 3 all the way to chapter 10. The title for today's teaching is The Plagues and Pharaoh's Hard Heart. I'm going to give you all that in 3 parts: the story, the elephant, and the treasure. You ready? All right, because honestly, it's seeming kind of dull in here. And I'm about to deliver an incredible amount of dense biblical content. And I was just hoping you seemed happier about the holiday weekend than this. But you do you. The story unfolds in these 2 major themes: Moses' staff and 10 plagues. So first, God appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush and commissions him as the unlikely deliverer of the enslaved Israelites, whose prayers God has heard and whose suffering he plans to bring to an end. And while that is both a supernatural experience and a huge honor for Moses, Moses is also very realistic about the call and the situation. He is a fugitive shepherd. Pharaoh is the most powerful ruler of the most powerful military on the planet. This is a dangerous confrontation, and it's not a fair fight. So there's this back and forth between Moses and God until eventually, at the beginning of chapter 4, Moses turns his attention from God to the Israelites and starts to ask things like, well, what if they think that I'm nuts? Oh, what if they don't trust me? They don't want to come with me, even if I say I'm taking them out of slavery? What if they don't buy the whole story about the voice from the fiery shrub? It's a legit concern. God responds to Moses' question with the question, what's that in your hand? It's a staff. Throw it on the ground. Okay. Moses does. It turns into a snake. He's terrified. I would be too. Very afraid of snakes. Always have been. God then says, pick it up by the tail. Moses picks it up by the tail. It turns into a staff again. This is all happening in Exodus 4. This said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Now hang on. Is this just some kind of reptilian magic trick so that Moses can prove that God's got his back? Why would this symbol, a staff turning into a snake, turning back into a staff, cue the Israelites to believe that it really is God who's delivering them and God who's speaking to them through Moses? Well, you have to keep in mind that the author of Exodus has gone to such great lengths to tie his story back to the Genesis story, to frame Exodus as a sequel to the biblical story of human origin, purpose, and meaning. And in Genesis, the deceiver behind the destruction of everything good is depicted as what? A snake. This isn't a magic trick. It is hypercharged with biblical imagery. God, through Moses, is declaring authority over the snake, the deceiver, the ultimate enemy of the human race. God has joined his hand to the hand of Moses in order to demonstrate authority over evil. God's hand neither causes evil to exist, nor does God entirely eradicate evil from existence, but God's hand does have authority over evil. And this, by the way, is where the repeated, constant biblical theme of God's strong right hand all comes from and all traces back to. It's God joining his hand to Moses' hand and Moses' staff. Later in Exodus, you stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In the Psalms, you have a strong arm, your hand is mighty, your right hand is exalted. In the prophets, for I am the Lord your God who upholds your right hand, who says to you, do not fear, I will help you. The prayer of David, quoted by Jesus in all three synoptic gospels, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool under your feet. And then the resurrection of Jesus means, according to the apostles, he is the one whom God has exalted to his right hand as Prince and Savior to grant repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. So check this out. The whole Bible is in Moses' staff and the symbol that God gives him. So Moses does it. He goes to Pharaoh and he drops that famous line, sing it if you know it, Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Whoa, baby. All right. So Pharaoh's response is fascinating. Pharaoh said, who is Yahweh that I should go to obey him out of Israel? I don't know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go. Now pause. Exodus is a book about people who knew God but forgot his name. Israel forgot God's name, meaning they forgot what God is like. They forgot the promises he made to them and the way that he relates to them. So God reintroduces himself to one of those forgetful Israelites, Moses. Then Moses awkwardly remembers and recovers God's name, Yahweh. And then Moses appeals to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's response is, who is Yahweh? I don't know Yahweh. And so instead of letting the people go, he just ups the oppression. You know what? Let's double the quota of bricks, but let's take the materials and make them smaller, less straw for them to work with, make them work twice as hard for twice as long. Moses is in distress because all he did was make things worse. So God responds, then the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh because of my mighty hand, there it is again, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. God also said to Moses, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself fully known to them. Now that last phrase is a confusing one. It's actually best translated, by my name Yahweh, did I not make myself fully known to them. So God is telling Moses, the oppression's been turned up, but what I'm about to do now will show the world what I am like. The way that I will reveal myself to the enslaved Israelites who have been praying to me will be as intimate and personal as I revealed myself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is important. God very directly claims that what he's about to do is a revelation of his name, his character, his person. And what God does is reveal his name in 10 decisive acts, commonly known as 10 plagues or 10 strikes against Pharaoh. 10 ways that God shows that he's got authority over the snake and offers Pharaoh the opportunity to change his heart. We're going to call them the 10 acts of decreation because that is what each one of these plagues are. It's decreation. They are not random, unfortunate incidents or divine torture tactics, but they are thoughtful acts charged with symbolism, revealing the name of Yahweh to both the oppressed and the oppressor. They are blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and death. So first, the Nile River turns to blood. Back in Exodus chapter 1, in an attempt to stop the fruitful multiplication of God's people, Pharaoh issues a nationwide genocide against all Jewish infant boys. Every time a Hebrew woman gives birth, if it's a boy, throw him into the Nile River. The first plague is Yahweh's straightforward confrontation to Pharaoh. I know what you did. He turns the river where the genocide's been happening into blood. I know what you did. I know the blood that is on your hands. Let my people go. Now, it's important for you to remember that everything that happens next, that the Exodus story is a mirror of the Genesis story. Page 1 depicts God's new creation and renewed blessing, which is interrupted by a curse from a new deceiver, and the plagues are the breakdown of God's good creation that was presented to us on the Bible's first page. Let me show you how this works. Next come the frogs. A week after the Nile turns to blood, Pharaoh's still stuck in his ways, and so God says the Nile will teem with frogs. Rewind back to Genesis. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures and let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. Teem is a pretty specific word. It's used only 14 times in the Hebrew Bible. 12 of them are here in the Torah. Team shows up in Exodus chapter 1 when the author is framing his story as a repeat of the Genesis story. And then it shows up again in Exodus chapter 8 when the author is framing the plagues as a decreation, a breakdown of God's blessing on his created world. What exactly do I mean by decreation? Well, the God revealed in Genesis is a God of life and order. He is a God who gives life and who orders chaos. And so God orders night and day, land and sea, land creatures and sea creatures. Are frogs a land creature or a sea creature? Yes, right? They're both. They're amphibians, frogs, which appear only here in the whole of the Hebrew Bible. Frogs are an illustration of the return of the chaos that God ordered. It is a decreation of God's good pattern that was introduced in Genesis. And that's not unique to the frogs. This is the pattern that plays out through the 10 plagues. But you're going to have to take my word for it a little bit more on the remaining 8, or we're going to be here all day. So let's move quickly. Next come gnats. Strike the dust of the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt, the dust will become gnats. Dust represents mortality in Genesis. Man and woman are created from the dust. The consequences of sin are from dust you've come, into dust you shall return. The dust is swarming in the air now. Your mortality is confronting you. It is pulling at you. A world designed for fruitful life is now swarming with death. What's the word for that? Decreation. Then come flies. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies. Swarms is Genesis language for the life that God created. Flies are insects that live off of decomposing things. Flies swarm around death. Where there was once swarming life, now comes swarming death, decreation. Livestock. Pharaoh still won't budge, so God separates the livestock of the Israelites and the Egyptians, just as Yahweh separated night from day with moon and sun to govern them. The language of creation is echoed again here, only in this instance it is to bring death rather than life. Are you seeing this theme that gets repeated in each one? Boils. The Hebrew word boil is the Hebrew word for snake backwards. If that occurred in English, it might seem coincidental, but in Hebrew that's actually a consistent literary technique used to draw in the attention of the reader and convey thematic meaning. Then comes hail. Hail will come along human, beast, and vegetation of the field. It's all the summary of the life-producing sources listed on days 3 and 6 of Genesis creation are struck in a single plague. Then locusts come to eat every tree, every green thing, and all the vegetation that sprouts on the ground. So it's death to all of the life that was listed on day 3 of Genesis. Then there's darkness. God said, let there be darkness, an exact inversion of that famous Genesis phrase, let there be light. And then finally, death of the firstborn. The final plague is set apart in a bunch of ways, and it will receive our full attention next week. For today, the first plague was God's symbolic warning to Pharaoh, I know what you did. I know the blood that's on your hands. And then finally, 9 chances later, God deals Pharaoh his own hand. The oppression that you have put on my people, I will now let come back onto your own house. Decreation, 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 decreation. These plagues are not random. They are the reversal of Genesis. They are a decreation of God's good creation, a cursing of all that God has blessed. In a biblical imagination, this is how God is doing damage control in his good world. And that is not a reach, by the way. This is not my poetic recasting of a horrible, violent story. This is the scholarly consensus and the clear intent of the author. Check this out. The plagues are very intentionally organized into 3 triads with symmetrically repeating phrases that match them up both vertically and horizontally. We do not have time for me to get into this without losing 90% of you to Bible nerddom. I just want to show you this chart to make this point, that the decreation theme that I'm showing you is not a reach and the plagues are not random. The author of Exodus has fit them together both literarily and mathematically. This section of Exodus is like reading a Rubik's Cube. It is nearly impossible to order properly without a patient, thoughtful mind. Whatever you make of the Exodus story and the God revealed by it, this is not ignorant superstition and it's not a fairy tale legend. It is sophisticated literature written very carefully and intentionally. This is the story that has outlived all of the other ancient Near Eastern explanations of the divine because it still holds water thousands of years and hundreds of generations later. What other piece of literature can claim that? One story, 3 parts. The story, the elephant, and the treasure. It sounds like the title of a children's book, doesn't it? It's the furthest thing from a children's story. My wife, Kirsten, was a really hard sell on spirituality growing up. She's one of those people that if she starts to feel like you want her to do something, immediately she resists doing it. She's not sure why. She just doesn't want to go there if you're trying to lead her there. So she's got all these hilarious stories of her parents trying to direct her toward Jesus as a child, and she's resisting at all cost. Like this one time when her dad read her and her 2 older siblings the story of Mary anointing Jesus with the full jar of perfume. And they were sitting around a fire, like in the family fire pit in the backyard. And then he invited each one of the children to go and get something really valuable to them and put it in the fire as an offering to Jesus, which is either wildly manipulative or beautifully creative. You decide. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. The point is, Kirsten's feeling like her dad wants her to be a certain way as a little girl, and so a guard shoots up, and so she brings her older brother's favorite video game back to offer into the fire of Jesus. Do you see what I'm saying? This is how she rolls. Except, as a kid, she loved the 10 plagues. Like, this story was her weakness. The story of the elephant and the treasure, it sounds like a children's book, but it's the furthest thing from a children's book. I'm reading you the story of an oppressor and an oppressed and abused people and a series of plagues that cause mass suffering. I don't know why it is that we tend to turn the most complex and violent biblical stories into cartoons and bedtime routines. But this is not a children's book. And if the story didn't convince you of that already, then the elephant certainly will. There's an elephant in the room in all of these decreation, creation, poetic events. Return with me to our teaching text. I'm going to pick up in verse 19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. Now, the English mighty used to describe God's right hand here is the Hebrew hazak, and it appears again in a very different context, just a few verses later. The Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do, but I will harden, hazak, his heart, so that he will not let the people go. That's Exodus 4:21. So it appears that Pharaoh's heart is as strong or as hard as God's hand. But the insidious phrase, of course, is I will. God says, I will harden his heart so that he will not let my people go. Do you see it? The elephant that just strolled into the room of this story? So the question is, did God harden Pharaoh's heart? And if so, is Pharaoh morally culpable? And that's a really important question. It's an important question because if this series of events is, according to God himself, how he reveals his name, how he shows us what he's like, then the conclusion we'd come to about who God is might be very different depending on how we answer that question. As different as me and Jason Green, or as different as Stephen Fry and Jerry Sitzer, as different as a 17th century American slave master and Howard Thurman. Two people looking at the same evidence, coming to very different conclusions about the God they reveal. So we'll take this question in three parts: who, when, and what. First, who is making Pharaoh's heart hard? Let's pick apart the evidence like a crime scene. In Exodus 3, which we read just a moment ago, God tells Moses, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. Now, this is not a statement of sovereignty, but one of foreknowledge. In layman's terms, God is not saying, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, preventing him from letting the people go. What he's saying is, I already know that Pharaoh won't release the suffering and enslaved unless he is compelled by a mighty or dramatic or hazak way, compelled in a way that matches the strength of the stubbornness of his heart. So unless God does something very, very extreme, God's people won't be delivered. Pharaoh is enacting such evil, public infant genocide by the drowning of newborns in front of their mothers, and is playing such hardball with God. Yahweh? Who's Yahweh? I don't know anything about Yahweh. That God will have to play hardball in order to get redemption done in the world. So the plagues are not God's design, but God's concession. This is not God's preferred method of redeeming the world. But because a human being, by their own free will, is enacting such unrelenting evil, this is the only way for redemption. But there's still the confusion. Both Pharaoh's agency and God's agency are introduced actively in the explanation of Pharaoh's hardness of heart. So who is making Pharaoh's heart hard? Hebrew verbs come in three types. There's the active, he is strong. There's the stative, he is strength, or he is in a state of strength. And the passive, he was strengthened. Take that to the evidence. Moses encounters Pharaoh in chapter 7 when we read, Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding, he refuses to let the people go. Now, depending on the translation of the Bible that you typically read, your version might say, Pharaoh's heart was hardened in this verse that I just read. But that is not actually grammatically correct to the Hebrew. You can trust me on this. I confirmed it with Bridgetown's own Hebrew Bible expert, who, out of respect for his anonymity, will remain nameless, but it rhymes with slim tacky. That's all I can tell you right now. The Hebrew verb here is in the stative tense, not the passive. It's ambiguous whose agency is actually active here. And as the plagues begin, we're not told that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but simply that his heart was hard. The first 5 plagues then alternate between neutral, we don't know whose agency is enacting the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh making his own heart hard. In the plague of blood, Pharaoh's heart was hard. Then in the frogs, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. With the gnats, Pharaoh's heart was hard. With the flies, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. With the livestock, Pharaoh's heart was hard. There's a pattern here. And then after plague 6, for the first time, we're told God got involved. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord said to Moses. To this point, all of the evidence has been pointing in one direction: Pharaoh. He is the only active agent in the narrative until after the 6th plague. So let's turn our attention from who to when. When will God harden Pharaoh's heart? There's some pretty unique things going on here in plague number 7. First, There are two references mirroring that previous alternating pattern from Pharaoh to neutral. He and his officials hardened their hearts, Pharaoh. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, neutral, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. That tells us at least that the previous neutral references do not imply God's active agency, because here the neutral is paired with Pharaoh's agency, not Yahweh's. So there is no biblical evidence to conclude that God has been hardening Pharaoh's heart up to this point. Second, this is the 7th plague. 7 is the Hebrew number of completion. Numerical significance is massively important and a literary device that is used repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible. There's no way for us to know for sure, but it seems intentional, like the author is strongly implying, if not outright declaring, at this point, Pharaoh has completely hardened his heart. Pharaoh is descending increasingly into insanity as the story rolls on. Even after the plague of hail, Pharaoh's own counselors and advisors come to him saying, "You're mad. You have completely lost it." What we're dealing with in this story is the psychology of a tyrant. Again, this is not God's preferred method for redemption. The severity of his action is dictated by the severity of suffering for the innocent. And then third, we have to remember that Pharaoh is a unique, not a universal character. It would be a mistake for us to read this story and then develop universal principles for the way that God deals with us. There is nothing run-of-the-mill about this situation. Pharaoh is uniquely powerful to carry out evil on a large scale, resulting in suffering for thousands and thousands of people. He is actively imposing mass race-based slavery and unthinkably brutal infant genocide. Even more, in Egyptian religion, Pharaoh was viewed as the chief god in human form. He is perpetrating evil in alliance with dark spiritual powers of evil and then claiming that race-based violent oppression is God's will and God's way, and Yahweh is not having it anymore. Sure, all of us have the same core condition in us that Pharaoh has, sin. But most of us do not have the same sort of agency to enact evil that Pharaoh has. Therefore, it would be dangerous for us to either ignore Pharaoh's hard heart, assuming that we're entirely different from that in every way, or two, build an entire theology of how God deals with us on smaller scales out of this one unique situation. So when will God harden Pharaoh's heart? God takes over agency after the 7th plague. And that timing is really important. This is the turning point. In plagues 8 through 10, God is the active agent in hardening Pharaoh's heart. But there is still an interplay of divine and human action noted in each one of these plagues. There is no point in the story where God just rips the steering wheel from Pharaoh's hand or becomes divine puppet master. What God does is, after many chances, become increasingly involved in the tyrannical volatility of this oppressor as a way to magnify his right hand, reaching out to rescue and deliver his people. God says before any of this begins, Pharaoh won't let go unless I act decisively and dramatically. And then God still gives Pharaoh many, many chances to prove him wrong. That doesn't happen. And so God's activity eventually turns from appealing to Pharaoh to appealing to the people. That all the people watching this divine human showdown would see plainly the character of God that is coming to rescue them. God takes over something that's already happening anyway, Pharaoh's hardness of heart, not to punish Pharaoh, but to direct the attention of the onlookers, of Pharaoh's advisors, of the Egyptian civilians, and most especially of his suffering people, Israel, that even in circumstances this devastatingly bleak, all who would notice can see his heart and respond to him. Think of God's action in this story like the score in a film, right? If you hear epic music behind dialogue in the climactic scene of a film, or scary music behind a scary scene in a horror film, the music does not change the action. What a film score does is direct the attention of the audience to the significance of the action. The action's playing out the same either way, but this is to direct the attention of everyone watching. That's what's going on in the latter plagues of Exodus. A film score begins to play underneath the action, and for what it's worth, it works. Everyone's attention is directed to the God who's intervening. Even some of the Egyptians see God's strong right hand, and they begin to submit to Yahweh's authority, not to Pharaoh's. In both the 7th and the 10th plague, which are the bookends of God's agency, we're told that some of the Egyptians responded to the warning and were sheltered from the plague alongside the Israelites. So Egyptians began to recognize and to turn to Yahweh, and Israelites began to shepherd the very people that were oppressing them. They began to love their enemies. So while there is unimaginably rampant and horrific evil, the kingdom of God is still growing up in this story like wheat among the weeds, to borrow from Jesus. And despite all of that, some may still struggle with the idea that God ever became active in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And I can understand that wrestle. I have no interest in pretending that there's no mystery here. This is far from a closed case. We're investigating the evidence. I'm giving you the evidence. But there's certainly still mystery here and room for wrestling with this story. But if that's where you are, then I do just want to pose this question to you. Would it say something better about God if he allowed Pharaoh's oppression rather than becoming active to reveal his character to his people? I mean, like from a parenting perspective, there's a level of mercy that helps my children mature. And then there's also a level of mercy that prevents them from maturing, right? If I'm just jumping on them about every little misstep, that's dysfunctional. But if I'm allowing one of my children to relentlessly abuse and hurt the other two without consequence, wouldn't that be enabling? And isn't that equally, or if not even more, dysfunctional? When does the scale tip between mercy or patience and enabling? If there's a question to wrestle with from this story, I think that's the one. So as for our elephant, we've got who and when, and finally now what. And if you've gotten lost in the weeds somewhere along the way, I totally get it. I mean, this has been biblically dense on a level that we're not normally going. But now is the time for you to re-engage, because here comes the moral of the story. What does it mean? It means even in the most horrendous human evil, God is actively working toward his redemptive purpose. This is not a story primarily about sovereignty and free will. It's about the fact that even in the most horrendous human evil, think war on Ukraine, God is not only not absent, but present and active in working for redemption. It's so important that we remember that the questions we bring to the Bible are environmentally formed by our own culture and context, and they may or may not be the questions that the Scripture itself is addressing. And when we try to force our questions onto biblical passages rather than let its questions become our questions, then we are highly vulnerable to misinterpreting or misapplying or manipulating the Bible. And that doesn't mean our questions are bad or wrong or that they shouldn't be asked. It only means that this passage isn't going to help you answer those particular questions or to see the God revealed in the story. And the questions addressed by the 10 plagues, they might be better asked by a Russian or Ukrainian than an American right now. Someone who's interacting up close with horrendous human evil playing out on a large scale that is then affecting me in a very personal way. Questions like, how do I pray if I'm living under the reign of a villain? Questions like, where is God? Does he hear me? Does he hear us? Does he even care? The affluent white Western millennial might read this story with tension. But what about the Ugandan child soldier? Or the displaced Syrian refugee, or the repressed Iraqi woman? How might they read the very same story? To properly see the God revealed in the 10 plagues, we must read it as it was written, as a story addressed to people who had experienced tremendous suffering throughout their history, asking, is God working out his purpose when tyrants are killing everybody? Is it possible that God is moving his purpose forward in a place like this at a time like this? And the straightforward and definitive answer of Exodus is yes. Absolutely. Even in suffering this broad and evil this abhorrent, God is living and active and working toward redemption to end suffering and evil. Even within the lifetime of a suffering Israelite slave who has had her child ripped from her arms and drowned in front of her, Yahweh declares, I am bending history to a day when no one will ever be a slave again. When no child's life will ever be cut short again, when no mother will ever grieve her son again, when no one will ever be able to wield power to abuse another again. This is not first a story for intellectual consideration and theological dictionaries. It is first a story of hope for the hopeless and good news for the suffering. Jason Green should be infuriated by the randomness of his daughter's loss. And Stephen Fry has every right to be outraged by children with terminal instinct. That instinct is the image of God within us. The injustice and suffering of this world is an outrage, and no one is more outraged than the creator of this good world himself. The missing element in Fry's diagnosis of the situation and his response to that reporter isn't the need for a deliverer, it's the reality of a villain. Yahweh is a God of hope for the hopeless and good news for the suffering because he is a God of co-suffering compassion, and he's a deliverer who will crush the snake's head. So finally, within a story even this winding and complex, there is great treasure. And the treasure is Yahweh. I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, Yahweh, did I not make myself fully known to them? That's where we started, and it's where we're going to end. The treasure of this winding, complex story is the God revealed through all of it. The treasure is Yahweh. One God who is perfect in mercy and justice. Observing Pharaoh in this story is like watching a callus form. How does a callus form? By repeated action day after day after day until at some point you can't just lotion that thing away anymore. It's hardened. And this happens in the human heart toward God. We choose our own name. We ignore his presence and his voice and his invitation. Through repeated action, we carry out in the same way day after day after day. Our hearts are rubbed until they're hardened. It is naive to read the Exodus story with the assumption that I have absolutely nothing in common with Pharaoh. C.S. Lewis says, there is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. Jesus went on to say, whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. Lewis says there's no neutral ground. Jesus says, and neither are there neutral people. Everyone must pick a side. The biblical story is one that supercharges our lives with such meaning that every choice we make is in partnership with either the kingdom of light or the kingdom of darkness. Pharaoh is a unique character in a unique position. There's nothing run-of-the-mill about this story, remember? But to completely ignore Pharaoh would equally be a mistake. To assume that what's in Pharaoh is not in me at all would be a mistake. There's this troubling trend in our culture today of diagnosing social ills while ignoring my own personal responsibility. We're growing increasingly quick to blow the whistle on structures and systems and trends, but much slower to bow our heads with contrite heart before God. We're quick to stand with female victims of sexual violence, slow to confess a pornography habit. Quick to stand with historically marginalized people groups, slow to reconcile with the friend I felt betrayed by. Quick to name a punchy soundbite on historic abuses of power, slow to confess the pride in my own heart that makes me hunger for power. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not arguing for one over the other. What I'm saying is that either side of the coin, apart from the other, allows a callus to form. Every choice we make is in partnership with the kingdom of light or the kingdom of darkness. So how do we remain soft-hearted? Well, in the Hebrew Bible, the verb salah, which translates to forgive, is only ever used with God as the subject. Yahweh is set apart in the broader story that this story finds itself within as the forgiver. By the simple, consistent practice of confession, I'm filled with the Holy Spirit who turns hearts of stone into hearts of flesh. This is what keeps my heart soft. When I realize again and again and again that God's grace is stronger than my sin, that his love outruns my failure, that his forgiveness is like the waves of the ocean that are ever lapping at the shore of my life, that Yahweh's name is mercy. And what Exodus shows us is that God not only drives out sin through his mercy, but he also fights sin off of us through his justice. Yahweh is the sacrificial lamb who takes away the sin of the world by laying down his own life, and Yahweh is the Lion of Judah who roars with authoritative justice at each and every way you and I are victimized by the corruption of his good world. The God that we meet in Exodus is a God of justice who fights for suffering, for the suffering until the villain is defeated and the battle is won. Jesus taught us to pray, Father, forgive us. That's mercy. He also taught us to pray, deliver us from the evil one. That's justice. And the good news is that God is both. He is mercy and justice in one holy being. It is good news for the oppressor that God is merciful. And it is good news for the oppressed that God is justice. It is good news for the beneficiary of inequality that God is gracious and loving, slow to anger, abounding in compassion and steadfast love. And it is good news for the victim of inequality that God is justice and that his end goal is a world without sin, and he won't stop until he's got it. Yahweh is the Lion and the Lamb. His name is mercy and his name is justice. And even as we respond today, some of us will be praying, Father, forgive me, keep my heart soft. Let your grace wash over me enough times that it seeps in deepest, that I know that you are the forgiver. And others of us will be praying, deliver me, rescue me, help me, fight for me. And maybe some of us will pray both. And that is precisely what makes the God revealed in this story good news. That Yahweh is one being perfect in mercy and in justice. So as you look at these events, as you weigh the evidence of the story, what do you make of the God they reveal? Two people looking at the same story may draw very different conclusions. Conclusions as different as Howard Thurman and the American slave master, or Stephen Fry and Jerry Sitzer, or Jason Green and myself. You get to decide, what do you make of Yahweh, of the God revealed in the story? And if this is who he is, what does it mean for your story and for mine? The plagues end with a promise that points forward to Jesus. The roaring lion of Exodus will humble himself to become a lamb whose blood covers every door, the door of every heart that will receive him. Jesus did not go to the cross because the Father was angry with him, well pleased. That is the description of the Father's heart toward his Son. Jesus went to the cross because he was working with the Father to display the mystery of perfect mercy and justice in a single being to heal the wounds of this world through a sort of forgiveness that is neither dismissed as wrong because it didn't matter, because as any victim knows, it matters. Nor does it condemn the wrongdoer because what's in Pharaoh is in me too. And to condemn one would be to condemn all. Jesus' forgiveness is one that upholds justice for every wrong and mercy for every wrongdoer. And that is good news for the whole world. And that is what makes the cross not a grotesque solution to an unfortunate cosmic equation, but the most breathtakingly beautiful act in human history. Because the cross of Christ is where God's justice and mercy meet together on earthly soil.